So this paper is mainly focuses on the international non-governmental organizations and what they do in order to change social and industrial systems. We are referring to organizations such as Oxfam and CARE. So differently than what has been published so far, which is mainly humanitarian aid type of research. We are not focusing on material flows, but rather on supply chains, INGO supply chains that deliver social and environmental services with the intent to change the capabilities, relationships, and practices of diverse stakeholders into that operate within a social or industrial system. And what was interesting to realize is that these supply chains, the main struggle they have is that they need to cope all the time with the active presence of external stakeholder groups in their operations. So if you think about a service supply chain, you usually have the customer that interacts all the time with your partners, your organizations, people that are working frontline. But in this context, this type of uncertainty, which is usually defined as customer-related uncertainty or input uncertainty, is pushed to the limit because if I can make an example, Oxfam recently launched a campaign called Women, Food, Climate. The goal of this campaign was to develop agricultural resilience in South African countries, agricultural resilience against climate change. So the campaign was mainly targeting, on one hand, small-scale farmers, small-scale producers in 6 South African countries, and on the other hand, governments in those countries and global corporations having operations in those countries too. So, and the main goal was to work with all these stakeholders to change their practices, to develop their capabilities. And these stakeholders were actively working and interacting with each other during the intervention. So, for instance, small-scale farmers received training in agricultural practices and business management practices. The government was influenced on local policies development, and global corporations were influenced on their sourcing practices. But what happened is that in order to enact change in that system, small-scale farmers were mobilized by the INGO supply chain to trigger change in the operations of the global corporations, and also to sign petitions for against the government to make this policy change faster. So, but it's very difficult, if you can imagine, to work with farmers, governments that might somehow resist or hinder or hamper your plans. And so you have to have this flexibility all the time to be able to adjust your activities in a synergistic way. So what we proposed, Rob and I deductively developed some supply chain configurations, so combinations of diversification tactics and coordination mechanisms that the INGO and the partners working with the INGO, that usually are civil society organizations, but also for-profit firms that deliver service, can use in order to make sure that they will adjust at the right pace their operations in order to affect the right stakeholder at the right time to enable change. So that's what we did essentially on the main issue that we addressed.
So for me, the primary issue that we were trying to explore is how are supply chains differently configured for not-for-profit organizations. And we focused on the context of international NGOs or non-governmental organizations. And what we really found is, to begin with, while on the surface they might look quite similar, there's some really important differences in terms of how they have to manage both for-profit firms and not-for-profit firms in their supply chains, and they have very different agendas. The other big issue was that the variety of stakeholders that care about what happens in an NGO supply chain are also quite diverse, and so that creates lots of challenges, tensions, and then at times disagreements, and ultimately that can hurt the performance of the supply chain. So the NGOs are really trying to enact transformational change, and in doing so, I think that's where organizations also have differing opinions. And so while one organization might see enacting a change in an African setting in a particular way, another, either for-profit or NGO within the supply chain, might see it in a very different way. And so that creates conflicts and tension.
I believe that the paper provides three main contributions to academics. On one hand, we describe and define how INGO supply chain work. In our field, in supply chain management, there is very little research that have unpacked the service operations and service supply chains in this specific context. And so we start developing an understanding of what change episodes they develop and how and what is the membership and functioning of supply chains in this context. And that can serve future research that would like potentially to develop a more rigorous empirical design and build on our paper. Another type of contribution, I believe, is related to our prescriptions. So we have theoretical prescriptions that need to be refined, validated, or even challenged. So I truly believe that by trying to look at existing supply chain systems in that context, and starting from our prescription of different diversification and coordination mechanisms, future researchers can really try to understand why certain supply chains are more effective than others, and eventually enrich our theoretical base in supply chain management.
So what we try to work towards in terms of the conclusions or thinking through some of the applications is sensitivity around how one has to configure these supply chains differently. And so in particular, adapting to the diversity of stakeholders. Some supply chains are actually quite uniform, and so the supply chain can be set up in a particular way that is quite different from another supply chain that in fact ultimately has to respond to very diverse stakeholders, maybe has many more volunteers, might involve government actors in terms of trying to modify behavior of farmers, for example, in Africa and so on. And so one of the big areas is to actually map out who the stakeholders are, how they can be integrated into the supply chain, and what has to change within the supply chain given the different groups.
Well, this paper has been developed based on emerging anecdotal evidence, but also we had a chance to discuss with managers at Oxfam, Novib, and other organizations in that space. And they really struggle to develop effective interventions because their supply chains and the partners within the supply chain really struggle to, on one hand, to work effectively together, and on the other, to make sure that they cope and react to the stakeholder-induced uncertainty. And I think our paper can guide them, on one hand, to take care of the rigid resources that they have. Rigid resources because differently than a for-profit context, in their context, they don't have profit to pour into their operations if there is something that need to be adjusted. And also they receive funding from institutional donors that often have conditions and constraints on how the money can be used. So it's very difficult to develop flexibility despite or while keeping accountability and while working within the conditions and the boundaries set by the institutional donors. On the other hand, they need to make sure that all the partners within the supply chain work in a synergistic way. But these partners usually are not related through contractual relationships. So there is no contractual power really. And still they need to deliver effectiveness. So how to do that? Our paper starts pointing out few mechanisms and tactics that can help INGOs to build effective systems.
Future, well, this is a conceptual piece, and so now we have to do some of the field work. We do have a number of stories and anecdotes embedded in our discussion, and we sort of unpack particularly Oxfam and how they've tried to make transformational change work with their supply chain. But that's one organization, and we have other examples, but it really requires more field work to understand how to best put some of these practices in place.